Hello and welcome to Indian Standard Time. I'm Siddharth Varadarajan. Now, you have writers who can be prolific and produce many books over a lifetime. And you have writers who perhaps write one or two books of such enormous depth that they gain a reputation for expertise in a field. Or you have writers who perhaps manage to write an insightful book on one or two or perhaps three diverse subjects and acquire somewhat of a reputation for being wide-ranging in their scholarship. But arguably the most prolific, insightful and wide-ranging author that I have ever read and encountered is Dilip Hiro, and we are very happy to have you, sir, on the show today. Author of 36 books, many of which I have at home, beginning with Inside India Today, which was your first book that I read, Inside Middle East, your book on the Iran-Iraq War, and of course your latest on India-Pakistan rivalry. Yours has been really a remarkable career of scholarship, I would say, of contemporary commentary, insightful analysis. Not only do you produce books on subjects which have an immediate resonance, but these are rich in history. Good. And they also are highly regarded as valuable contributions to ongoing debates, hence your status as a well-regarded columnist at Yale Global, The Guardian. We publish you in The Wire as well. Welcome to the show. This is a great honor. And what we want to do in the next 25 minutes is to introduce our readers to Dilip Hiro, the writer. Tell us a little bit, learn a little bit about your own life story and how it is that you came to become interested in writing on such a wide range of topics. And then, of course, hopefully pick your brains in terms of some of the recent contemporary developments, particularly in West Asia, which you have also written about. So let's take it from the beginning. You were born in Larkana in undivided India and moved at some point in the 60s, perhaps as a student, and then to work to the US and then settling down in the UK. What is it that led a man of your interests and talents into neither academia, which some would say would be the obvious place for you to go, or journalism, working for a newspaper, but this remarkable niche of producing these books that are scholarly, but also accessible to laypersons? How did you get into this writing of books?
Yeah, I think I say up front that, I belong to the tribe called NRI. Though I've been living in London for many years, I still have Indian passport. So I remain a Paka Indian in that sense. Now, yes, in terms of my writing, yes, I would say that, well, I would call myself a professional writer. And of course, as you said, often somebody who is with a think tank or a journalist, they may write one or two books on a particular subject. But I started out, my first book actually is a novel. Out of 36 books that you mentioned, 5 of them are fiction, including plays. I've written plays.
Right.
And so, you see...
So you first tried your hand at fiction. Was that your first published book? Fiction was your first effort?
I think my first book was A Triangular View.
Okay.
It's about 3 young Indians living in Britain. It was published in London, and then Rupa published it as a paperback. That was in 1969. It came out 71.
Were there any autobiographical elements in that novel?
Yes, I think I drew partly on myself. I could not be 3 personalities.
Right.
A Triangular View with 3 different people. Right. One is somebody who actually was a Goanese and settled in Britain and married an English woman. The other one was a student at Imperial College London, passing by, right. And myself in between.
Okay. So
that was Triangular Views. That was my first attempt at writing. And I have to say, if you start out as a writer of fiction, then you understand one thing: words are everything. In fiction, words are everything. So you understand the exact meaning of what you are saying, and that can be very useful if you're doing non-fiction or whatever. See, and that was very helpful, very difficult. At the same time, I also researched Taj Mahal, how Taj Mahal came about, and so on. Actually, where I used to live, I even now live in West London, Ealing. There used to be a restaurant called Taj Mahal Restaurant. So that gave me an idea, and I started research that. I spent 18 months going to India Library and to understand all of the Mughal dynasty and so on and so forth. Then I focused on, of course, Shah Jahan and Mumtaz Mahal. What I found, there's nothing about Mumtaz Mahal in print, as a record.
And then you produced a play actually on
Yeah,
this.
that's what I did.
Yeah.
I filled in that thing, and actually I wrote the play in 1970, and I can say without any immodesty, it's a feminist play. And since then it has been revived here, and there will be a performance on the 25th year.
Right.
Yeah. So I mean, I'm mixing different styles of writing, but ultimately it comes down to the use of language,
Right.
precise language, and that you learn very well if you are doing fiction.
Dilip, one of your early books was Black British, White British, on race relations, as it were, in the UK. You came to the United Kingdom at I would say, an interesting time for migration of migrants from India and this part of the world. Initially quite welcoming, then you had Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood speech, then the crisis of the Ugandan Indians arriving and Britain in a way shutting its doors. In the 70s, the rise of the National Front and racist attacks. And then, of course, a long period of multiculturalism when Britain, I was an undergraduate in London in the late 70s, early 80s, and have marveled at how that country has evolved from being quite unreceptive and quite unfriendly towards immigrants to in the last 5 years being much more open and welcoming. Then you have, of course, the Brexit vote, which has shocked everybody. But in this long view of race relations or multiculturalism in the UK that you are privy to, from the late 60s up to the present, would you say that evolution has been positive, it's been linear, it's been in one direction, or have there been setbacks at various times when you have wondered about the direction the country of your, the way you live is taking?
See, in terms of my own writing, if I can relate to that, having written a novel, to find a publisher when you have not published anything before, very difficult. So I started to do journalism. And in journalism, race relations became important because in 1967, there was a think tank which said, yes, in this country there is discrimination. Right. So that gave me an opening. And then a year later on, Enoch Powell made his notorious speech.
Rivers
and then,
of Blood,
race relations took off. You see, so and out of that grew my book, Black British, White British, in which I have West Indian, Asians, and White British. And then having done that, in fact, my agent said, well, you want to go to the Caribbean and write something about it for the American authors? I said, no, I want to do a book on India. And when I did that book, in the early 70s, I traveled for 18 months all over India. I went to 31 villages.
This is what became Inside India Today.
Yeah, Inside India Today. And that book was banned during emergency.
Yes. No, it was I consider it a remarkable book. I think until Ramchandra Guha's more recent work, your book Inside India Today was perhaps the most comprehensive account of that period, of the initial years of India's independence, and it didn't surprise me because you were quite honest about the emergency and the circumstances leading up to it, that the government would take action against it.
That's what. And also, I think what I did was, because see, I'm studying obvious. India is a very complex entity. You have to structure in a certain way. So what I did was left-wing forces, centrist forces, right-wing forces. And that's how I divided the book. And after emergency was lifted, my book came out in 77, very widely reviewed, very positive reviews and so on. And somebody said, that so far we never had a book which explains all of it.
Exactly.
So that's,
So I think that was its unique feature, because it was written, it was accessible, and it had a kind of comprehensive account of the way Indian politics had evolved after partition.
You see, but having an India with a very complex entity, I keep repeating that, I first must say, let me do something equally complex. And that's how I got into the Middle East. But there again, one has to make a distinction. If I had been living and working, say, in USA, New York or something, nobody would have touched it. They would say, oh, what kind of a postgraduate degree do you have? Such and such area, very specific.
So how did you manage to convince publishers that you, as a British Indian, as an NRI, with no particular scholarship or language skills in West Asia, are equipped to write books on Lebanon and the Middle East? How did that happen?
That's interesting. I think, you see, my book was first commissioned by Penguin, and somehow the whole thing got messed up. It was then published Routledge and Kegan Paul. And there's a young editor, Peter Hopkins. I'm afraid he died of alcohol, drinking too much alcohol. But my book did very well because it came out in Britain during emergency. did very well. So what happens is, if you've done a book, so your publisher takes you out to lunch, say, what's a new idea? I said, Peter, I want to do something equally complex. I want to do a book on the Middle East. Okay.
So that was inside Middle East.
Yeah. But I mean, I have to say that you might call this gentlemanly publishing. And that's how I got it going. And I think I have to say again that because, you see, anybody, Western person approaching Middle East, they carry cultural background.
Exactly.
They're either Christian or Jewish or Muslim. So I have no
or steeped in a kind of colonial mindset in any case.
When I was doing this, I didn't have any cultural background, cultural baggage to carry. I went to Israel, so many things, and that really worked very well. It has worked very well for me in the Middle East. My things are supposed to be, to use a cliche, quite objective.
Yes. How much of the research, I mean, how much travel or first-hand information do you draw upon for, you mentioned touring villages in India before you wrote Inside India Today, but your book on Lebanon, written at a very difficult period when civil war was raging.
Yeah.
Israel-Palestine has never really been calm. You wrote about Iran at the height of turmoil, the Iran-Iraq war. How much of your methodology involved you traveling to these places? How easy was it to gain access to officials or others that you wanted to speak to?
I think what happens is, when you talk of a book, basically it has three components. One is that, you read other books and you get some kind of a summary in your head. Other one is direct reporting. And third one is your newspaper articles and so on and so forth. Plus, of course, you have to have your own viewpoint, you see. So it's a combination of these things. Now, okay, when I did India, I told you 18 months touring around. I have to say I learned so much about India. Or let me put it this way. If I go to any village, 6 people will gather. Of course, people gather all the time. 1 out of 6 knew what was going on, exploitation. But there was no agency, political agency to put it together. Anyway, so when I did Middle East, I traveled everywhere, except Saudi Arabia. They wouldn't give me a visa. And of course, they're very bureaucratic. But I've been everywhere. And what is very important, if you say...
And you were given visas, they knew that you were coming to write a book?
Yeah, of course, yes. See, I had a very good contact with Arab League ambassador in London. And he gave me his description. Basically, I said, I'm writing a book on institutional Middle East. And that was...
That opened doors
go through, you see. And of course, what is very important, that if somebody says I'm building Egypt, I have images of what I saw in Cairo. When somebody, Beirut, I have images. And that's very important in your mind, that you have real people who sort of populate what you may be writing in an abstract fashion. Same thing. When I did a book on Central Asia, I went to all the stans, and there again, it's a different thing. So yes, when I do this, but once I have done that, then I don't have to go again and again and again. In Iran, I have been quite a few times. In 1979, I went to Iran. Sunday Times sent me to Iran at the time of American hostage crisis, November 79. And that really was a... See, if you go to Iran, of course, I don't know, you have
been there, yes.
See, North India and Iran, there's so much in common. There's so much in common. And I still remember, of course, you have to have a local translator and so on. His name was Farhad Ganji. We left the hotel with him, and I read the signs of the shops and so on. What? You're coming from London, you can read this thing. As it happened, this guy was also the guide for V.S. Naipaul, who wrote this book among the believers.
Very different kind of book.
Anyway, so I'm saying, things came together, and I think I have been there during Iran-Iraq War. So I did a book on Iran-Iraq. I had actual images, and I have been to Iraq before. And when I went to Iraq, very interesting. You see, of course, Baath Party was running this thing, and I had some letter and so on and so forth. So the guy who came with me, we have a very good opinion of you. Never mind. So I went to Najaf and Karbala, and and I'm not Muslim. And of course, I was allowed, I went in all the way into the shrine and so forth. And after I had done all that, my guide says to me, if somebody knew that you were not Muslim, I'll let you in. I'll be like this.
Right.
Now,
Now,
but again, because if you go there, if it's Ya Allah, Ilallah, Muhammad Rasulullah, you can eat. I've got no problem saying that. So, and the same thing, going to the old city in Jerusalem, you go to the Al-Aqsa, and so on and so forth. So I think that way, people, they look at you, they think you are Arab. I have been taken to be a Jew.
Right.
When I go to there, and speak to him in Hebrew.
Right. So and of course, you followed up your interest in the Middle East and Central Asia with the remarkable book on oil. Tell us a little bit about how, was that commissioned or did you hit upon that idea?
Yeah. All my books are commissioned. You see, I have an agent, and that's how the whole publishing works. Okay. If you live in London or New York, you have to have an agent. So you prepare a proposal, synopsis, outline what you want to write, and then your agent will try and find a publisher.
No, what I meant is that the idea occurred to you, or did somebody come and say, why don't you write a book on oil?
Now, most of the time it's my idea, but there have been quite a few instances where somebody has come and said to me, how about this? Now, somebody was a series editor. He was doing all isms. So he said, Dilip, how about doing fundamentalism for me, in the series, which was done by HarperCollins in London. So that way it works sometimes. And in other cases, because I had done a book earlier between Marx and Muhammad, Changing Face of Central Asia, Peter Mayer, who actually set up the Penguin here, and he runs his own company. He came to my agent, I want him to update the book and put some culture into it. So I think sometimes it comes, other times I come up with the idea and so on.
And after a very long and impressive tour of the entire Middle East, in the last few years, 2 of your books at least have been about the subcontinent. You've written about the partition and the continuing rivalry of India-Pakistan, which is your book that's come out this year in India. And I believe in 2015, was it? Or 2014? The book on political economy, which was released at Sapro House, Indian Council of World Affairs, where you also wrote about corruption and the role of money power.
I think the Indians and globalizing world. I think that really sums up the whole thing. Nowadays, of course, there is such a kind of a, like globalization is looked down upon and people are against it and so on and so forth. In the Indians and globalizing world, I really put so much together because what I did was I had global approach. So I looked
and you went back and did field work also.
Yeah, but also looked at Indians in Silicon Valley, Indians like Mittal and so on, in the UK, and then in India. And I always start with the peasant. My opening chapter will be agriculture, how it's been doing, and so on. So I think yes, and of course, and all people talk about so much corruption and so on and so forth, and I always try to go to the root of the thing. Here is the root. Now, in the days when the British were running India, and they were Congress Party, and of course the Congress Party won an subscription, that's not going to really get you very far. And so it was funded by Birlas and Tatas and so on. So why? Because they wanted their own market against the British capital, you see. And from those days onwards, early 20th century, businessmen putting money in Congress Party goes all the way to that period. So it's not a new story, it's an old story, but I always go to the root to see why it happened, and that is a great challenge.
Right. You have written a few pieces recently on the conflict in Syria. Perhaps a book will follow at some point. But I wanted to use your expertise as a close observer of the Middle East to help our readers in the 7 or 8 minutes that we have left to chart a course. How can the world chart a course away from what seems like terrible, terrible conflict without end in Syria? Various proposals are on the table. There is some hope with Trump coming now of the US and Russia working together. But for that to happen, there needs to be agreement on the Assad regime and on dealing with the non-ISIS extremist groups that have been funded by the Saudis and the Qataris. How do you see the Syrian conflict evolving in the next year or so?
I think when you mentioned this, it has to do with, I did a book, After Empire, The Birth of Multipolar World. I published this book in 2010 in the US and the UK, and so I've been tracking this relationship, of the world powers, for a long time. And here, of course, you see, if you talk about Syria, there are three things to remember about Syria. One is that, of course, minority subsect in Syria, who Alawi is part of Shia Islam, they are ruling majority Sunni, 70%, and that's basic problem. Okay. Second situation is that when Syria became independent in 1946, from 1950s onward, they were friends of the Soviet Union. They never came under the aegis of America, you see. And then Hafiz Assad, who was Bashar's father, he was an anti-imperialist, and he was very consistent. And because of that, when Islamic revolution happened in Iran, Syria was the first country to recognize it, because he saw the anti-imperialist. See? And so there's a consistency. And if America did not have much...
And also to the support for the Palestinian cause and so on.
Precisely. Yeah. I see, if one keeps these in mind, then you can see what's happening now, in a way makes sense. And of course already...
So that explains the implacable opposition of the US and the Western camp, quote unquote, to the Syrian government, but to the Assad government. But in the context of the rise of extremism after 9/11, and which is obviously a big concern.
Sure.
Why is the US still being driven by the earlier binaries when they repeatedly say that their main enemy now is violent Islamism and so on, and they identify Al Qaeda? How did they end up in a situation where they have funded de facto groups allied to Al Qaeda?
No, I think very simple. I mean, I have to speak in slogans now, which is, you see, as long as there was Soviet Union, anything to beat Soviet Union, and essentially, if you remember, Ronald Reagan was president, such and such guy who is a dictator, he's a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch.
Right.
So in Afghanistan and Pakistan came in, they were going to do all that. And how were they motivating these people? They said, these people are atheists and they are not nationalists. So we are giving you nationalism and belief in God. Now, all the non-Afghans who were programmed and educated in that way, when they went home, when they went to Egypt, they said, my God, America is running the whole show. So America is the same as the Soviets were in Afghanistan, And so they use that particular perception to do this thing, and then you will find, this is a cliche, blowback. There was a blowback, and they are eating the hand which fed them. No such thing. They are being logical. You train them, you made them aware, nationalism is important, and belief in God, whatever, etc. And that's all they did. And all of that, of course, Al Qaeda, Bin Laden, and so on and so forth came through. But now I have to say one thing, since we're talking Syria, as soon as Bashar Assad, King Abdullah went against him, strong mullahs in Saudi Arabia, they set up their own committee, etc., and say, pay money to such and such a bank account.
Yes.
Within 24 hours, the intelligence came, closed it down, because they did not want unofficial sources to start funding these things. So in a way, they learned that if it's not all unofficial thing, then it is going to eat you up. It'll be,
But is there any indication that under Trump and with the possibility of a Trump-Putin entente or understanding of some kind, that there may be light at the end of the Syrian civil war tunnel?
Now, I think in Syria, what's going to happen is, you see, already, when there was this big meeting in Astana in Kazakhstan, actually the Russians produced an outline of a new constitution, new governing system, and elections, and so on and so forth. Yeah, they gave that to the rebel groups. So they're already thinking ahead, and I think ultimately what's going to happen, the 2 points, sticking points. One will be, will those Syrians who have left and living in refugee camps outside the country, will they be allowed to vote?
Right.
And secondly, will Bashar Assad be allowed to vote, to contest, And I think on that, Assad would say, okay, if I'm to be rejected, let Syrians reject me. So you can't keep me out. And that's going to be a sticking point. It'll take another 2-3 years. But I think there's an end to this rock tunnel.
Right.
In 2 to 3 years' time.
We are virtually out of time, but hopefully your wisdom and insights on Syria will not only be manifested in columns that we will read, but there will be a book too at the end of, or perhaps before the war ends, or perhaps soon after it ends. But thank you very much for sharing your insights with us and your life story. It's been a real pleasure, sir.
My pleasure. It's a great pleasure to know that you know so much background of some of my books. And
well,
so
I've been following you for a long time. Well, that wraps up this episode of Indian Standard Time with Dilip Hiro, author and I would say scholar of India, Central Asia and the Middle East. Do join us again next week when we will have another guest for you. Thank you so much for watching.